Welcome to Law Talk. I'm Clay Williams. I'm a partner at FH&P Lawyers, and we've got Colin Flannigan with us today, and we've got a great topic. We're going to talk about how to protect vulnerable people from being exploited. Serious topic, actually. And just before you start, I just want to say, to our listeners that Colin's been a real help to me when I've had, quite numerous clients have asked about what they can do when they see signs of exploitation it's usually their parents that are having some, mental decline, if that's the right word, and are making questionable decisions. And, of course, they're really worried about their loved ones and what can they do. And Colin, you've been a real help to explain what they can, or unfortunately what they mainly can't do.
You don't often like what I have to say.
but you're the person that really knows the law in that regard. And so, Colin, you do a lot of the estate and adult guardianship and that type of thing, those type of cases. So, usually from my perspective, Colin, I'll get a call and it'll be, my father's making really poor decisions. He's doing, I've had, just off the top of my head, I've had a situation where, father lost his license and he went down and he bought a car. And that pissed me off. I thought, a car dealership that is selling a guy who doesn't have a license a car, but those are usually how I'll get involved, and I'll say, talk to Colin. So why don't you tell us about some of the background of the law and what you can tell people that are concerned that their loved ones are being exploited.
Yeah, and one of the big things where this comes in as well, too, is going to be not just about erratic behavior, but maybe impacts of other people on that behavior, right? And, some of the questions are, that new friends or interlopers that are spending time with mom or dad now, and where's some of that money being spent? So I guess the first thing, to think about is this, is when it comes to capacity and guardianship, there's a lot of not perfect answers here, because there's a lot of people feel that there might be some gaps in how people can be looked after. So first concept is going to be capacity, all right? Losing capacity, or even before I even get there, having capacity for different things is a different type of capacity, or what is necessary, right? Like the ability to buy a car and having enough capacity to do that isn't necessarily the same type or level of capacity to execute a will or power of attorney, right? Having capacity can be complex, especially in waning capacity situations. Because for some people, loss of capacity might be a traumatic brain injury, right? Get in the motor vehicle accident, maybe a traumatic situation like an aneurysm. But for the vast majority of people that have capacity concerns, it's not a light switch, right? It isn't like that. It is more of a waning scenario. And when we're talking about that, someone going through a waning scenario, especially when it's degenerative in nature, it's not necessarily even a straight line down, right? It's more like a ship on the seas, right? Ups and downs, good times a day and bad times a day. And just because, that parent may not have had capacity one day, doesn't mean from that moment onwards, they'll never have a lucid moment again. Right? They maybe were entirely lucid when they showed up at the car dealership the next day and had the ability to execute a contract of purchase and sale to buy that new Audi, even though they have no driver's license. Mm-hmm. So, that's the first things to understand is it's not a simple situation where it's all black and white here. In this area, there's a lot of gray. When we're looking at the gray, first concept is saying, how do we even plan for it in the first instance, right? If we're planning and making sure we're setting up, documentation, if we were to eventually lose capacity ourselves, usually you're looking at things like power of attorney for being able to do some legal, but mostly financial decision-making, paying bills, filing tax returns, that sort of thing, or healthcare decision-making, which is often done as a representation agreement. So that's usually kind of how the pre-planning works. But the problem is, especially when people get into these complex situations later in life, even if they've granted the kids maybe this power of attorney in the representation agreement, they've now got the new friend, new caregiver, that new caregiver might be trying to shop them around, take them to different lawyers or different notaries, trying to get new powers of attorney or new representation agreement granted to the new friend, to try to control assets. And, that gets really difficult from as far as, well, what can the kids do in that situation?
One of the things, just to jump in though, is how what an important role lawyers have as gatekeepers in that situation,
As lawyers, that's something you got to be very careful about. Like, I know myself as a lawyer, when I get someone come in that's not a client of mine already, it's a new client to the firm, never dealt with this before, and it's a friend who books the appointment. There's red flags, right? I'm not saying it can't be done, might be completely all above board, or there could be something untoward. So as lawyers, we've got obligations to make sure we're doing our due diligence, and we're asking, making sure this person has capacity, not just, do they know who their family members are and what their assets are? Yeah, that's an important capacity element when it comes to testamentary capacity. But if we're looking at powers of attorney as well too, do they actually pass the capacity test for powers of attorney and for healthcare decision making? And one of the things you got to ask about as well too is undue influence, right? Like, who are you naming? And why are you naming this new friend or your new caregiver? You want to add them into your will as well too, right? So as lawyers, we've got obligations to make sure we're testing there. And sometimes, sometimes being pressured into doing it, right? And I even know as a lawyer, sometimes it's not something I've done very often, but it's something I've even talked to people sort of saying, well, look, are you being pressured here? You need to make sure you meet with that person alone. And if they are feeling pressured, saying, well, look, are they saying that they're not going to care for you anymore if you don't do this? Well, yeah, they're the only person that takes me out anywhere. They're the only person I have. I've got a kid, but the kid lives out in Ontario. So in that situation, sometimes you got to get creative. Sometimes you make a dummy will, it's not a dummy will because you actually really do sign it saying, and there's $100,000 going to my caregiver. But then immediately afterwards, you execute a new will that revokes that one, that does exactly what the person really wants.
Oh, wow.
And then that way the untoward person thinks that they're getting the gift that they were expecting, and so maybe they might still help this person. But as a lawyer, you got to make sure you're honoring your client's obligations, right? And that they're not being unduly influenced, and that any documentation that you are going to sign and witness for them is truly their intentions, right? And that's on us as lawyers to make sure that that happens.
So I think the first level or step that you said, it was setting this up in advance, and that's putting it on you as a person. Yep. Saying, look, if I'm getting older and maybe there'll be some mental decline, I should have things in place. But that doesn't mean that I've lost control of my money, does it? I mean, so even though I've executed a power of attorney, even though I've said to one of my kids, say, you take that power of attorney, that doesn't mean I can't go into the bank then, does it, and go and buy a car? And
there's two sides to that coin, because you're right. On the one side, from the person given the power of attorney, if I'm giving you my power of attorney, I might not be ready to give up all my authority, right? Because sometimes when people give up all their authority, then they start to withdraw themselves. And you can actually see a negative impact even on their health as well, too, if they just start checking out and giving up, right? So when someone gives the power of attorney, if I give you my power of attorney, I might still want to make sure I'm still involved on my decision-making as well, too. So that's a positive from my perspective on giving you the power of attorney. But on the flip side of that, the other side of that coin, is I might still go buy that new Audi even though I had my license taken away, right? Yep. So by not, when I give you that power of attorney, that's not taking away from my own rights and my own abilities. Because, the reality is this, there's a difference between eccentric and, say, someone wanting to spend their money, because guess what? It's their money. If they've got the ability to spend their money, and that's still their choice, and they're not being unduly influenced, they're not being coerced into doing it, and that's just their decision, and it's a folly decision. It's still their money, and they're entitled to make a poor decision. And you could also not give up the power of attorney. That's the other thing, is you can put it all into place, but decide, oh, I'm fine. I don't need to give it up at this stage anyway, right? So, but that's good advice. Everybody should have a power of attorney, and I don't know about a rep agreement, but, certainly a power of attorney. And I would say representation agreements can be very important as well, too, especially when you've got different people that might want to make decisions. Because to be perfectly honest, when we're talking about, say, end-of-life decision-making, it's a very personal decision, right? It's based on our own personal beliefs, what we've seen people go through. And making sure we've got someone that can make that choice for us, whether or not it's that's one of the things that gets focused on, is the end-of-life decision-making with representation agreements. It's not the only thing. But making sure that someone's got the authority to do it, So we wouldn't be kept alive in a situation we wouldn't want to be kept alive in. Say if you're in a permanent coma and your heart stops, would you want cardiac resuscitation or be put on intubation, right? And having someone being able to make that choice. But, also depending on who you want to make that choice is putting a lot on them. It can be very stressful. So if you're a child and you're in the hotel or in the hospital room with your parent and you've got to potentially make that call, having a document that even sets out some advanced wishes on where that parent maybe wants treatment to be stopped, that can make it so much easier to make that decision, because when they look, they're like, okay, so in this section in the representation agreement, mom or dad said that if they're in a permanent coma, they would want a blood transfusion if it would relieve them from pain, but they wouldn't want to be put on kidney dialysis. Okay, so what's going on here, doc? What are you actually saying? And then try to be able to make the decision to best match that. So by relieving some of the stress, there can still be some other benefits for representation.
And I didn't mean you shouldn't get a representation agreement. I don't know how that's not as important to document for somebody who may be suffering from declining mental facilities, I think, is it? In terms of being exploited by somebody else, a new actor, maybe somebody, a car salesman who's like, well, you know what, I'm going to make the sale.
Well, perhaps you might argue saying level of importance. I wouldn't say no importance though as well too, because if someone is, say, going through a waning capacity, what about someone going into the doctor's office with them and the doctor saying, yeah, okay, maybe this person does have the ability to buy that car, right? And the representation agreement gives someone the access to their medical records, including a lot of times talking with them with the doctor's appointments.
Well, I see.
There is still significant importance there, especially if you've got a family member who has got one of these new friends involving in their life. If the kids have got a representation agreement, then perhaps it's something that they can be discussing with the doctor and saying, I've got real concerns about the influence this person's having on mom or dad. I don't think they should be involved in their decision making.
And so what can be done?
Well, that's the problem, right? Is because unless someone gets to the point of incapacity, like not just waning capacity, but incapacity where you can actually have a court order done under the Patients Property Act declaring someone as being incapable of managing themselves and or their affairs, an appointment of a committeeship, it's tough because getting to that threshold is significant because it requires medical opinion presented in open court, not one but two medical opinions about saying that someone is no longer have the ability to manage themselves or their finances, their estate. And it's a pretty significant threshold. And for those people that have seen someone going through a waning capacity, from when they clearly start showing perhaps concerns to when it actually gets to that level, the doctor's going to say, yeah, they cannot manage anything anymore and willing to give that under oath. There's a lengthy period of time where there can be some problems. And that's where some people feel there might be some gaps in our guardianship legislation, right? I mean, unless someone's being, involuntarily committed, and even then that's really only can be temporary for certain issues. And often you see that more in psychological issues. Someone's no longer on their medication, say with schizophrenia. Outside of that, when you're talking about the waning capacity, there can be a lot of gap situations, which can be very frustrating for a lot of people.
But is there somebody that people can call, or a government agency perhaps that would get involved if there's a concern that somebody's being exploited that way? And I'm not talking about the somewhat unethical car salesman. I'm talking about the situation that you talked about, a new friend who's come, moved in maybe, and this is my friend who drives me everywhere, what is there anything that can be done?
In that type of situation, sometimes the entity that people will look to is probably most often the public guardian and trustee's office, the PGT, and they've got a pretty wide ambit for different areas. And one of the things that they do look after is looking into concerns about vulnerable individuals, perhaps being exploited in that type of a situation, and, sometimes if someone doesn't have someone, right, they don't have a friend or family member they can name as a power of attorney because they've lost everyone or they just don't have anyone that they trusted, and that they are potentially being exploited by this new person, that's where you sometimes see referrals. Sometimes it comes from a friend or a neighbor that's seeing that something untoward is happening. Sometimes it might be from, even I've heard of banks sometimes doing referrals to the public guardian trustee's office that this person is being taken advantage of.
You read about that in the, well, usually for me on Castanet now, but those stories come up quite a bit, where the bank is taking that role and acting as a bit of a, maybe a lot of, I don't know, of a gatekeeper there too.
Yeah, well, there's sometimes from a bank's perspective, they can look at it from a risk, right? If they know that something untoward is happening and this person shouldn't be getting exploited like this, what kind of obligations are on them at that point?
Every day I'm reading a story about an elderly person who's been scammed. It's like something comes up on their computer screen. It says, call this number,
And scam is one thing. One of the things we're talking about here is also about when there's a concern on someone's ability to make their own decision, whether that's from an incapacity or an undue influence, or even to the level of coercion as well too. Yeah. And in that case, the public guardian trustee can act as a public committee of someone's estate, meaning handling their finances, if they are declared incompetent. In this case, usually with the public ones, it's usually just done by a certificate of incapacity by the local health authority, and then the PGT might be able to step in and manage someone's finances to prevent a fraudster taking advantage.
Do they have the same hurdles to go through?
It's a different process than if it's a private.
Is it easier than trying to get an order for a commutation?
It's usually a much quicker and easier process because it doesn't require the two medical opinions. It still requires medical evidence in the form of the certificate being issued by the health authority, but you don't require the same level of open court hearing in the doctor's affidavit. So it can often be done in a quicker scenario. So particularly when there's concerns about a fraudster taking advantage of someone right now, sometimes people have done that and tried to get the PGT involved right away just to stop what's happening.
So that would be the first call, I take it then?
Sometimes it can be. A lot of times the first call ends up someone like me, goes to a lawyer saying, hey, this is what's happening. What can I do? And so my job as a lawyer,
I know, and then, or to me, and that's what I call you. So
so what I can do is I can just walk people through what are the options, right? And a lot of times there isn't the perfect, easy answer saying this is what you should do. These are the different options. These are the pros and cons of the different options. What is the best option to take in those is going to depend on the circumstances. It's not always A, B, or C, or always do this. It'll depend on the circumstances and what's actually going on in this situation about what is the option that maybe makes the most sense.
Yeah. So to summarize, help yourself. Make sure you've got proper estate planning documents in place.
Appoint people you trust that will look out for you, even when you end up maybe later in life and you can't look out for yourself anymore, maybe are being influenced by someone else that will still step up and help you when you need it the most, even when you don't realize you need it.
What about those poor people that never had kids, or there's just nobody there? How does that work?
And sometimes when I'm going through that with people, the question comes up on who can I name as a power of attorney, right? Because it is a situation of a significant amount of trust, because powers of attorney can be abused, right? So it's got to be someone you trust that isn't going to abuse that authority. So yeah, sometimes it's naming family members. Sometimes maybe, sibling, niece or nephew, because sometimes we need to look at younger generations. Sometimes people have to look a little further afield. When they start looking at neighbors and things like that, that can perhaps be a little bit concerning, because what is the level of trust? I mean, there's a difference between being friends with your neighbor and, neighbor friends, you've known them for 10, 15, 20 years, but to actually trust them to manage all of your finances, we're talking about perhaps a different dynamic to the relationship. Now, I know sometimes people will even look at professionals, like say looking at professional trust companies to be able to be appointed as a power of attorney. Yes, it's not necessarily going to be cheap, but you get what you pay for, right? If they're going to do a good job, and for some people, that's the best choice they can make, is making sure they've got a professional that is going to make sure it gets taken care of the right way.
Geez. Okay, well, what else do you have to talk about on the topic? Any other pointers for our listeners, or?
Yeah, what I would just say is this, is, if you know someone that you're worried about, what they're going through and perhaps changes in behavior, sometimes you got to have frank conversations with them and sort of saying, hey, look, have you got your plans in order? Because you need to get, as long as someone can make the choice themselves and being able to do the documents, it's a much easier and straightforward process, doing a power of attorney, representation agreement. Because if you leave it too late and you don't have the capacity to do these documents anymore, then you're might be looking at either the public guardian trustee involvement or the private commutation, which can cost thousands of dollars and take months to get in open court. So,
And you're not helping anybody by, if you've lost capacity and you don't realize that's not good for yourself or anybody.
Yeah. So big takeaway is, one, set up your own plan. Number two, if you know someone that is starting to struggle a bit, check with them, make sure that they've got a plan in place as well too.
Fantastic. Well, we're really lucky to have you, Colin. Thank you. And thank you for answering my clients' questions when they come up. So, all right. Get an estate plan if you don't have one. For FH&P Lawyers, until next time.